Hi everybody, it's great to meet you all. I've gotten such beautiful letters and I want to thank all those who wrote. They were very inspiring and it made me feel quite humble to receive such nice reports from all of you, who've read my story. Actually one of the girl, I have a letter here that came from a Miss Vickers. Okay. She had questions regarding why we would go to Germany in 1939 when things were already looking quite bad in Germany, or what had been written and told about, and even in 1938, about what has happened to the Jewish people and how they were gathering them together. Well, the reason we went is because my mother, she married my father and came to America and left a family of 11 brothers and sisters, and she came from a beautiful family. So when she had received a letter from Germany telling her that her father was dying of cancer, she became so homesick that everything she ate she vomited, couldn't keep any food in her stomach. So she went to see the doctor and he said to my father, "John, you have to take her home. I have no medication for her." Don't forget, this was in 1939, and they've come a long way with medicines today for people who are that depressed, but at that time they didn't have that. So he suggested she go back home, that he take her home. Now they knew things in Germany did not look well, but nobody expected a war to start. So we decided to take a trip, and my mother wanted us to definitely meet my grandparents, or before something happened to my grandfather. So we headed off to Germany, and I was 5 years old, Peter was 6. And we actually did not know how to speak English, because at home in Naples, being actually an Italian town, there were very few Italians, maybe 3 or 4 Italian people. The rest of them were all German. So from the time we were born, we learned how to speak German, and everyone who came to visit spoke German. So Peter started kindergarten and he was learning English, and there were a lot of German teachers in school, so it was no problem learning. So he was teaching me some of the American words and everything, but I really wasn't paying too much attention. So when we left for Germany in 1939, in August of 1939, the only thing that I really knew in English was the Our Father. So when we were on board ship, they had one night where the children had to perform for the passengers. Well, Peter and I didn't have any talent. So my mother dressed us in matching sailor suits, and we got up on the stage and we said the Our Father, first in German and then in English. Well, I knew the Our Father in English from going to church and learning it there. So it was no big deal. Well, we became king and queen of the ship. And I couldn't find a picture of Peter and I, him as king and me as queen, so I just named my book The Queen of the Bremen. But it was really about Peter and myself, our life. And so when we arrived in Germany, everything seemed great. Going to my grandparents' farm was, for me, awesome, because in Naples, all we had was our own family. Peter, myself, my mother and dad, and it was just all we ever had at Christmas time or holidays. We had no one to celebrate our holidays with. We had no other relatives here. So now to have all this huge family, all these aunts and uncles and cousins, and my grandparents, for me it was awesome. Well, we were there just 2 weeks when when they asked us to get back to the ship immediately. So by the time we got back to Bremen, they examined my mother and found out she was 7 months pregnant. And they said, "We have no way of taking care of you in case the baby is born early. There's no incubators on board ship. There's no way to take care of you. So you're going to have to wait till the baby's born." So they send us back to our grandparents. But now we're in the system. The Nazis already knew who we were. So they send us back to our grandparents, and 2 weeks later Hitler declared war on Poland. And all borders were closed and we couldn't get out. So now my father had to find employment. And I think in your question you were asking, why did my father work for, or didn't let anyone know about the underground, or how anybody didn't know that there was an underground ammunition factory where he worked. See, that all came later. My father had to find employment. And now the only way he could get a job was my uncle who worked in the city of Rüsselsheim, which is near Frankfurt, Mainz, those main cities. Rüsselsheim was a large industrial city. And they made things in the Opel factory that were used in the home. And also, I don't know if they were making cars then there or not, but they might have been. But no one knew about the underground ammunition factory, which was monstrous. They had ways of driving vehicles into the factory from underground, and no one knew about this. And they didn't want the Allies to know about it. And the only people that were employed there were prisoners. So they had French prisoners, Polish prisoners, Russian prisoners, and whoever they wanted to arrest. They had them work there. Well, my father was now considered a prisoner because he was an American citizen. And he had been a German soldier in the First World War, been wounded twice. He was an officer in the cavalry. And because he had fought for Germany, that was the only reason they did not arrest us, because they had a lot of respect for their soldiers. They still do. As a matter of fact, my father was an American citizen for 50 years. When he became ill, he sent his records from the doctor's office to Germany. They sent him a pension. His pension amounted to over $700 a month. That was way back. That was in before the 50s, actually the 50s. He received $700 a month from Germany, from the government, because he had been a German soldier in the war and had been wounded. And that pension, when my father passed away, 15 years later, when my mother passed away, the pension stopped. But she was taken care of just as well. And that was the way they took care of their soldiers. They still do. There's really, you don't have to go take collections for veterans. The German government takes care of the people. And so my father was considered a German soldier at one time, so they did not arrest us. But they put us on a watch. And every move we made was watched by the Nazis. They were just waiting for us to make a mistake so they could arrest us. That was their whole plan. So the first thing they did was they cut our rations in half of what the German people received. And the German people did not have enough rations to keep their children alive. The only way you could get better rations is if you joined the Nazi Party. Now, if you joined the Nazi Party, the only thing you had to do was inform on your neighbor. Anything that you might have heard that didn't sound important to you was important to them, because you're a rabble rouser. You are a person that can cause a problem. So they would listen to what you had to say, and all of a sudden, these people started disappearing. Not only the Jewish people, but the German people as well. And they had the Pope who spoke against what Hitler was doing in the concentration camps. See, we didn't know they had concentration camps. The German people did not know. The Nazis knew, and the German people were not all Nazi. It was like a Democrat and Republican party. Some of them were Nazis and the rest of them were not. And my family never joined the Nazi Party. Nobody was ever involved with them. And they would come and they would order men to go into the war. It didn't matter who you were. There were no draft dodgers in Germany. If you refused to go fight, they shot you in your doorway. You had no chance of saying no. So the men that went into the war, that fought, were like fathers and brothers and uncles that you have here that go and fight in the war. That, they sign up for the service and they go and fight. These were not Nazis. These were German people who did not like what was going on, but they had no choice. So they went. My grandmother, she had 5 sons. They were all taken into the war, and the 2 son-in-laws. So I had 7 uncles that fought in that war. And those men were always sent out into places like Russia. The Nazis, they stayed close to home. And the reason that Hitler started Hitler Youth was because he would train people like you. Girls and boys were trained to be his army at home. The German soldiers who were fighting in the war in Russia and in Africa and all over the place, they were never allowed to find out how badly Germany was being bombed. They didn't know. Because if you wrote a letter to a German soldier, it was always read by a young girl from the Hitler Youth. And if there was anything in there indicating that there were bombings going on in the city, that was all crossed off. Those soldiers didn't know. So they kept fighting to keep the German people alive, not realizing that their cities were all being destroyed, that we were not winning the war. Oh, we're winning the war. That's all you would hear Goebbels, the big propaganda man, say. We're winning the war. Well, the German soldiers never realized that that wasn't true, but they had no way of finding out otherwise. But they trained those young kids. Every airplane that was lost over Germany during World War II was shot down by children, because the Nazis wouldn't get up in those towers and risk their lives. They sent the kids up there, and they were taught how to shoot those planes down. And any American plane or British plane that was shot down during the war was shot down by young people like you. 14, 15, and 16-year-olds. That's what he used his Hitler Youth for. And he used the girls to write the letters to the soldiers. And every time you send a letter to a German soldier, you never had to put a stamp on it. And if you send a package to a German soldier, you never had to put postage on it. All free. That was all taken care of. But they always knew where these letters and these packages were going. They checked through everything and made sure. So the Hitler Youth was used for that one purpose. When they came to get us to join the Hitler Youth, my mother was very concerned. And I know I read history books and they say that they started taking kids in the Hitler Youth from the age of 10 and up. No, they started much younger than that. Because when they came for us, I was 7, Peter was 8. They wanted us to join the Hitler Youth. And my mother was so worried. She says, if my children ever join, we'll never be able to get back to America. And she said, what am I going to do? So when the Gestapo came and said, we have to sign them up, the only thing my mother said was, are you sure Hitler wants my children? They're American citizens, you know. And they came back 2 days later and said, we don't want them. They can never join the Hitler Youth. Well, that was a big break for my mother, but it was a big loss for Peter and I. Because it didn't take the kids long to find out that we didn't come to the meetings and we didn't have uniforms. And they found out that we were Americans. We were the enemy. We were the dirty ummies. And so they used to beat us up going to school and coming home from school. They threw rocks at us. They ran their bicycles into our legs. They knocked me down. They pulled my hair. They used to beat Peter up. And you know, not one teacher would help us. Peter would end up with a bloody nose. Nobody would help him. You just had to make it on your own. So we would try to run to school and run home from school to try to avoid being beaten up. And we used to go home and say, why can't we just join the Hitler Youth? I only speak German. I don't know what an American is. I don't even remember America. I was only 5 when I left there. Why can't we just join? Why are we different? We speak German, we look like Germans. My whole family is German. My uncles are fighting in the German army. Why can't we join? My mother said, because you'll never get back to America. And Peter and I used to say, we don't even know where America is. And she used to tell us all these beautiful things about America, and how there was food, and how there were street lights, and how you could turn a light bulb on in your house, and how there was no war, no bombs, nothing. And people were free to go wherever they wanted. Well, we didn't have that freedom. And for me, all these stories sounded really great, but I didn't think there was such a place. The food rations for us were so bad, and the people, the German people, had it just as bad. So like I said, they joined the Nazi party. And then they would have to let the Nazis know whatever they heard. And just as a for instance, there was a Nazi, a young boy, he was in Hitler Youth. He went to a Hitler Youth meeting, and his mother's parents lived about 3 houses down from them. So when he went to the meeting, she went to see her parents. While he was at the Hitler Youth meeting, they gave him a beautiful big picture of Hitler. Told him to take it home and hang it in the nicest place in the house. Well, when he came home, his mother was still visiting with the grandparents, and when he walked in, the best place he found was over the fireplace. There was a crucifix. So he took the crucifix down, hung up the picture of Hitler, and waited for his mother to come home. And when she came in the house, that's the first thing she saw. And she said, "What's this?" And he said, "Well, they gave it to at a Hitler Youth meeting and told us to hang it in the nicest place." And she said, "What?" She took a chair, she got up, she took the picture, and she smashed it on the floor. And she says, "Never is he going to replace God in my house." And she hung her crucifix back up. Well, the next Hitler Youth meeting he went to, he asked if he could have a new glass and a new frame. You see, everything you needed a ration card for. Even a mouse trap. You needed a ration card for everything, and everything had a date on it. And if you didn't use it by that date, your card was gone, was worthless. So he asked if he could have a new frame and a new glass, and they turned around and asked him and said, "Why would you need that? What happened?" And he proceeded to tell them what his mother had done. Well, while he was at the Hitler Youth meeting, the Gestapo car, they told him, he said, "Your mother doesn't understand how important our leader is to us. We have to inform her." While he was at the meeting, they went to the house and asked her to come with them in this Gestapo car. And they said, "We have to discuss something with you regarding your son." So her parents happened to be there that night, and she said, "I'll bring him home with me from Hitler Youth meeting." So he says, "Don't worry, we shouldn't be long." No one ever saw her again. She just disappeared. See, he turned his mother in without realizing. That was something you could not do. You couldn't speak anything against the Nazis. Nobody could. So you had to watch who the people were you spoke to, because you didn't know. I didn't know if you were a Nazi or if you were a Nazi, and I didn't know how to speak to you because you just had to keep quiet. So what happened was, no one asked questions, but people were still disappearing. And those people were put in concentration camps right along with the Jewish people. We had a good friend that lived across the street from a Jewish lady, Mrs. Stein, and her husband. They had a hardware store in the city, and she was always so kind to my mother. When she would come, my mother would sew for her, and she would come, and sometimes she'd bring her 3 or 4 potatoes, or she would bring her a small piece of bread. And that was enough for my mother to give us something to eat. So Mrs. Stein was always so kind. They were Jewish. And one day she came and she said to my mother, "We've made arrangements. The Nazis have allowed us to either go to Switzerland or to France, but we can get out of Germany," because the Jews were being rounded up constantly. Where they went, we had no idea. Nobody knew where they went. They just disappeared. So now when Mrs. Stein came and said that they were leaving, my mother said, "Are you sure, Mrs. Stein? Are you sure? You know, we're Americans. We have no way of getting out. How come they're letting you go?" I wouldn't take the chance. I wouldn't go. And she said, "No, we already sold our business to them. They've given us double what the money is worth, or our property is worth. They bought our house, told us to leave everything in the house the way it is and only take our personal belongings, anything of importance to us, that we can carry in a suitcase." My mother said, "Please, Mrs. Stein, I'm so worried for you." And she said, "No, we're going to be all right. They promised us we're planning on going to France." Well, she says, "As soon as we get there, I will send you a letter and let you know how we got out, and maybe you can do the same." We never heard from Mrs. Stein again. They got on a train, and no one knew where they went. We found out later where they went. But they took them right away to a concentration camps and then took their meager belongings away from them, so they had all their money back anyway, and the next day they had a Nazi family move into their home. That's how they did things. There was no freedom. You have no idea what it's like to live in this country, to have the freedom, to buy a house where you'd like to buy, to go to the schools you want to go to be able to speak to people about things. Well, it's getting a little shaky now because you have to be very careful what you say because it may not be politically correct. But we never had that before. But we have to watch that those freedoms don't get taken from us. There's no place on earth like America. I would never have said that when I was in Germany because I didn't know that there was such a place like here. They started cutting our food rations to the point where we were getting 2 pounds of horse meat a week for 5 people. If we got there in time and our ration card was okay. 3 loaves of bread a week, which doesn't sound bad. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday we could go get bread. Now you had to be in line by at least 6 o'clock in the morning for the bakery to open at 9. So Peter would go and stand in line for an hour. Then I would go and stand in line for an hour. And then my mother would come with my baby brother who was finally born. She would come with the baby and she'd stand in line. They would open the bakery at 9 o'clock and there would be an SS man or some Nazi would be standing at the door, and they would sometimes they were nice, they would let 15 people in, sometimes only 5, sometimes 10. It all depended on what mood they were in, and then the bakery door would be closed and your ration card was useless. But if you were a Nazi, you could go in the back door and get all the bread you wanted. See, all you had to do was join the Nazi party. That's how they did it. So there were many times we had no bread for the whole week. My mother just happened to be too far back in line, or he only let so many people in. We had no bread. We lived on the little bit of food that we could grow in our gardens, and my father brought 2 baby rabbits home from the factory, and we started raising them, and I couldn't wait. We're going to have a nice rabbit dinner sometime when these rabbits get fat. Well, the thing is, we never did let the rabbits get too fat because the bombing started, and when they came and started dropping phosphor bombs, they sometimes released those bombs from the plane. And when that phosphor would fall on your vegetables that grew above ground, you couldn't eat them because they poisoned you. You would die from that. So we would go after a bombing and we would pick certain vegetables from the garden and feed 1 rabbit. If the rabbit survived, we could eat those vegetables. If not, everything that grew above ground was lost. So you had to live on potatoes, carrots, beets, anything that grew underground, hopefully. But that's what we used our rabbits for. They were our guinea pigs. When the food became so rare, they would make my mother come into the city 5 miles just to show her papers, always the same papers. My father's naturalization papers, Peter and my birth certificates, their birth certificates, our tickets on the Bremen to return to America, always the same papers. They'd seen them over and over, they knew them by heart, but they just made her walk 5 miles to bring the same papers just so she would get angry, waiting for us to make a mistake. So then they could come and arrest us. But she never got angry. But every time she went, they cut something from our rations. They finally cut all of our fuel rations. We could not get any coal. We, being Americans, could not go into the forest to look for fallen wood so that we could have some heat in the house. They cut all of our soap rations. We had no soap. You know what we used to bathe with? Vinegar and water. We used to smell just like salads when we went to church, but we were clean. That's what we used to do. And then to wash our hands and faces, we used to use weeds. Rub them under the water, the chlorophyll in there makes like a foam, and that's what we used to wash with. But that's what we had for soap. Now to wash our clothes, my mother made a linen bag, and there was a zipper on it, and we would take the wood ashes out of the stove, put them in that linen bag, zip it up, and she would put it on top of the stove and let the water come to a big tub that she had, let the water come to a boil, put that bag in there, and then take all of our white clothes, put them in the water, and with a stick, she used to poke them around because it was so hot, that water was so hot. When those clothes came out, they were as clean as if they had been bleached. There's nothing cleans clothes better than wood ashes. But it has to be in a linen bag so it doesn't get on the clothes. And then she would, when the water cooled down, she would put our colored clothes in, and then when it got cool enough, she put our woolens in. That's how we washed our clothes. And we had no heat in the house. We used to have a small potbelly stove. We would bring in Germany, they have these big foot pillows, all made out of down. Like they have the comforters for your beds now. But these were big pillows that went from your feet all the way up to your chest, and they were filled with down. When you wrapped yourself in a big pillow like that, you stayed nice and warm. And then we would go out and get bricks, put them in the oven, in the little stove that we had there, get them nice and hot, wrap a towel around it, put that down by your feet, and if your feet were on that brick, you could sleep because it kept you warm. So if your electricity ever goes off, that's what you can do. If you want to stay warm in your bed without electricity, heat up a brick in the oven or on a grill, whatever you have. Wrap a towel around it, put it in your bed, you sleep all night. It's wonderful, but that's what we did. We lived on weeds. Chamomile flowers in Germany grow everywhere. We used to make chamomile tea. We made our own coffee. We would go into the fields after the farmers through collecting all their grain, and we would get all the little ears of grain that were left over and bring them home. We'd clean them all out. We'd take the little kernels, put them in a frying pan and brown them. And once they were nice and brown, we put them through a coffee grinder, and that's what we drank. That was our coffee. I thought that's what all coffee tasted like until I came to America, and I was in my first restaurant ever. 12 years old was the first time I was in a restaurant in New York. And my father, the waitress came and she wanted to know what we wanted to drink. We thought there was never anything except coffee like the coffee we made. So we ordered coffee. And the waitress looked at us and she said, "Your children want coffee?" My father said, "It's a long story, just bring them the coffee." And my mother used to say all the time, "I can't wait to get back to America to have a good cup of coffee." And I thought, boy, America coffee's got to be really great, right? So when she brought the coffee, we're sitting there and I'm starting to drink the coffee and I thought I was going to get sick. I said, "This is spoiled. How can somebody drink this?" My father said, "That's real coffee." I said, "This is what Mom couldn't wait to get back to America for?" I said, "It's terrible. We have better coffee in Germany." My father said, "That's not coffee. That's just grain you've been drinking." That was the difference. But anyway, we would make tea out of the chamomile flowers, which are very healthy. I ate the chamomile tea. I ate clover, dandelions, grass, anything that was green, just to stay alive. And when I came back to America, I was 12 years old. I weighed 42 pounds. My father, 5'11", weighed 90 pounds. My mother only 70. So you can imagine what we went through. There was no food. There was one time we had nothing to eat, and we were not allowed to go into the forest or into the orchards to get fruit. That was only for the German people, not for us. We were considered prisoners. My father could never leave the city for any reason because they were afraid that he would let someone know that that was an underground ammunition factory that he was working in. The Allies weren't allowed to know that. So anyway, we had no right to be in the orchard, but my brother had brought a little red wagon from Naples when he came. He brought that little red wagon with him and loved having it. We took that little red wagon and we decided it was 9 o'clock at night. It was a beautiful moonlit night, and we know for sure because the families that lived around us, upstairs and on both sides of our four-family house, were Nazis. They were there to keep an eye on us. And the walls were so thin you could hear through them. So they always watched us. But we figured it's 9 o'clock at night, we never do anything that we shouldn't. Maybe if we took that wagon and went into the orchard, we could find something. Because my father came home, there was nothing in the house to eat. So Peter and I went at 9 o'clock, took the wagon. We had to go down the forest line into an orchard. And my mother told us, whatever you do, never take an apple from a tree because it's stealing. And I'd rather starve than steal. Well, maybe she felt that way. But I'll tell you what, when your stomach hurts so bad because you're so hungry, you kind of forget about the stealing part. Just look for anything that you can find to eat. So we went into the orchard, and of course the German people were hungry. They had already gone through the orchard. There was nothing on the ground. She says, pick only fallen fruit. You cannot pick from the tree. There was nothing there. So I said to Peter, Peter, if you climb in the tree and shake the branches and the apples fall on the ground and I pick them up, won't be stealing. Mom said as long as they're on the ground. That's what he did. He went up there and he shook the branches. The apples fell on the ground. Boy, you got to see how fast I was picking. And I picked them all up and put them in the wagon. I was in my glory. And from the tree, he saw a dark figure coming down along the woods. And he knew someone must have reported us. And Peter said, someone's coming. Well, we got so frightened. He jumped down out of the tree. We grabbed the wagon, and I think I hung onto the back of that wagon. My fingers almost went through the steel on the back of the wagon. That's how frightened I was. And he was doing the same on the front. He was pulling the wagon. We were running in the opposite direction, and my foot slipped into a bomb hole. When those bombs fell, they left a crater big enough to put the foundation of a cellar. Whole house you could put down. That's how deep those bombs went. There would be groundwater would come up, and when it rained, be more water and then mud, and if you fell into a bomb hole, your chances of survival were zero, unless someone was there with a rope to pull you out. Well, there we were. My leg is slipping into a bomb hole, and Peter spotted it, and he pulled the wagon real hard and just pulled me out of there in time before myself, the wagon, and Peter all ended up in that hole. We would have died in there. So now we ran all the way home, and we sat behind a house in tears and shaking, and our hearts felt like they're coming right out of our chests. It didn't stop. That fear just did not stop. And we sat back there for the longest time, and finally everything started to calm down, and we decided to go to the door. And my mother came. She says, where have you been? It's 11 o'clock. Oh my gosh, where have you been? I said, Mom, it takes a long time to find apples on the ground. Look at all the apples we found. We never told her what had really happened. She never knew how we got those apples till years later. And then she said, I still think you stole those apples. I said, no, Mom, you said as long as they're on the ground, it's not stealing. So I never felt like I stole any apples. But we got home, and we had something to eat. Then came the time, like when I said about the bombs, there were 3 different kinds of bombs they dropped. The spring bomb, which is a bomb that goes down into the cellars or into the houses and blows everything from the bottom up. Then they had what they call the Luftmine. Luft means air, and Mine is a mine. So it's an air mine. When that hits the ground, everything above the ground disappears. You can lose 10, 15 homes completely gone. And then they had the phosphor bombs. Those were terrible. They were small bombs. They were maybe about this high. They were like a straight canister, and inside was a rod. And that rod would come up, and there was a propeller on it, would spin the phosphor, and wherever phosphor hits, it burns. All it needs is oxygen. There's nothing that puts it out except stifling it in mud or sand. And there's no sand or mud to be found when you're on fire from phosphor. And it runs like egg white. You try to pull it out and it runs, and you can't stop it. And once it hits a human being, the chances of that person surviving are 0, because oxygen is in your body. It burns you alive. Do you know we were bombed out in 1944? Because it was in 1944, 1945, the war ended. It was a year after, just before. I just found out not too long ago that night that they came into Rüsselsheim, the Allies must have found out about that underground ammunition factory, and they were trying to destroy the whole city. They bombed our city with 400,000 phosphor bombs. The whole city was an inferno. They could see the planes could see it from miles away. They could see that city burning. and all the people who died in that fire that night, because when those bombs hit your house and you were in the basement, you tried to come out and that phosphor got on you, you couldn't survive. There was no way. Our house burned down in minutes, and the only thing we were able to get out was the suitcases that we had in the trunk. My father dragged my mother's sewing machine and a couch outside. Thank God they had dropped the big bombs before that, because if they had dropped them while they were doing the phosphor bombs, we would not have survived. But we were sitting in our lawn, and the phosphor bombs were still falling. The faith that we had in God watching over us, and people don't believe that there is such a thing, but believe me, He watched over us all of our lives. Even when bad things happen, He still watches. Because when morning came, there were 4 phosphor bombs around us. None of them had gone off. And if only one had gone off, we would have been torches outside. Nothing could have prevented us from being burned alive. We made it through that bombing. Of course, we lost everything. And I had a small doll that my mother had bought me here in Naples before we left. And it was a replica of the Dione quintuplets. Now, I'm sure none of you know about those, but maybe the older people do. Those were 5 girls that were born in Canada at the same time, identical. Well, I was born the same month and the same year, so my mother bought me a replica of one of those dolls where you could feed the doll water and she would wet her pants, and I had all these little diapers that I used to hang up, and then I brought that doll with me to Germany. That was my only toy. Peter had the little red wagon, and when my little brother was born, actually we had to report to Nazi headquarters to let them know that my brother had been born. We were going to name him John Joseph, but they wouldn't allow us to give him 2 religious names. They said we had to give him a German name. Well, in Germany, Siegfried is a big legend. It's like Robin Hood here. Siegfried was a great guy, very strong. So my dad says, well, name him Siegfried John. So they did, and they put a swastika on his birth certificate. He still has that. That's in California now. I'm glad it's not in my house, because I will not allow that in my house. But that's how they even made us use, they had to tell us how we could name the children. But Johnny was born, actually, he doesn't want anyone calling him Siegfried, so he became Johnny when he came to America. But Johnny was born over there, and when we had bombings, there is nothing that anyone has ever experienced that is more frightening than sitting in a cellar when those bombs explode. You can hear them coming. It's like going to the fireworks. You hear those rockets going up, you hear that whistling noise, then you see the beautiful display of the fireworks. When the bombs come, you hear them as well. They whistle. And when they hit the ground, you'd better have your mouth open, because if you don't, your eardrums are going to rupture. You have to have your mouth open when the bomb explodes. The air pressure from those bombs killed more people than the bombs themselves. We had an oak cabinet in our kitchen area. The window, the glass from the windows, because of a bomb falling, not hitting our house, a bomb falling in the area. When it exploded, that glass went flying into that cabinet so deep you couldn't even see it. But if you went to run your hand down that cabinet, it was like getting cut with razor blades. The glass was embedded in that oak. And it was like that in all of our walls. The glass just shattered into there. And when I first came back to America, we had to go into the school. We had to stand up for it was, I guess, supposedly a bomb scare. And they had all the kids. This was a central school, so the kindergarten kids were down in the basement area, but the older, the other kids, they had to be on the main floor. And they had us stand up against the wall, put our arm up like this, put your head against your arm, and stand up against the wall. And Peter and I refused to do that. And so when the principal couldn't speak English, so when the principal came and said, "Why are you not standing up against the wall?" And the German teacher that was there, she asked us, and we said, every one of these students would become like a fly on a windshield if a bomb ever came anywhere near this building. You had no choice. We would be flattened against the wall. And the glass behind us in the cases that they had with all the trophies inside and the big doors, the glass from that would embed those, it would just bury them into the walls. Every one of those students would die. You have to either be laying flat on the floor, be in a cellar, or have something over the top of you to prevent you from being killed. The fear that goes through you when those planes come, you can hear them coming. You can hear how hollow they sound because they're full of bombs. You can hear them coming. And you sit in the cellar and you wait every day. Sometimes 4 times a week, sometimes only 2 times a week, but it was every week, every month, going on and on and on, and it never stopped. When those bombers would come, and you would sit there frightened to death. And I would hear my mother pray, Lord, if you're going to let us die tonight, let us all die together. Can you imagine every single day? You don't worry about what you're going to wear. You don't worry about if you got your homework done. You worry about if you're going to see tomorrow. You wonder if you're going to live another day. Then you had to worry about starving to death. Then you had to worry about the Nazis beating you to death, or about a Gestapo car coming to pick you up. Fear was all we lived with, every day, all the time. 7 long years. And then the British started coming and throwing dolls and fountain pens with explosives in them. So when a young girl would pick a doll up, tip it upside down, because most of the German dolls, when you tipped them upside down, they would go mama. They would take the doll and tip it upside down and it would explode. The fountain pens had a little lever on them, and the old fountain pens, you had to put that in an inkwell, pull the little lever and it sucked the ink into the pen. As soon as you pulled that little lever, it exploded. And the kids were being maimed and killed by these bombs. And so Hitler was worried about his Hitler Youth, so he decided to have all of the children that were in those grades sent to the towns because the towns were not being bombed. So we were all sent out. My brother Peter was able to go live with my grandmother. My grandmother didn't have enough food to feed both of us because the farmers, everything that belonged to the farmers belonged to Hitler. He came and took their potatoes, he took their wheat, he took their grain, he took their cows, he took their chickens, he took the eggs, the milk, everything, the pigs, everything that they had belonged to Hitler. So the farmer was left with just enough to survive through a year, unless you were Nazis. Then you kept all your things. I was sent to go live with my aunt. And I'm sure when you read the book, you heard of, you know about my aunt. We didn't know she was a Nazi informer. The entire town was afraid of her. No one spoke to me in that whole town because I lived with her. They were afraid of her, so they didn't trust me. If you've ever felt lonesome, if you've ever felt left out, ever felt nobody cares about you, nobody makes friends with you, you really feel down. How long do you think you could go like that? No radio, no books, no one to speak to you, no one, except the teacher. And then I had to sit way back in a corner by myself while all the other kids were around the teacher because I was covered with lice. My head was like an anthill. And nobody would wash my hair. Nobody washed my clothes. No one ever spoke to me. The kids in school made fun of me. They kicked dirt at me. If a ball rolled where I was, they would scream, "Don't touch the ball," because they were afraid something would get on the ball. I was all alone in the world. And then she told me my parents were dead. And then she told me my brother was dead. And I had no one. Not for a couple of weeks, not for a month, for an entire year, I was alone. But you know what God gave me? A cow for a friend. I had that cow. She loved me. And I would sleep in the barn because I couldn't stand the lice crawling on my pillow. And I never believed for a minute, really truly believed my parents were dead. But when my mother finally came, I was scared to death of her because I thought she was a ghost. But my mother could not come and get me. We had to stay there for a whole year. There was no way that she could come and get me. And the letters my aunt was sending to my mother telling her I had a lot of friends and I had no time to write. I just said hello and I wanted to say hi to everybody and I was fine, I was happy. All lies. And every letter I wrote to my mother, she never sent them. And I'm wondering why I'm not getting letters. And then she told me they were all dead. Because I never got a letter, not one letter in that whole year. I went to church every Sunday. In the afternoon, I would take my cow and go to a field and I would make a beautiful flowery wreath for her to hang around her neck and over her ears. And I'd walk her home and she looked so pretty. And I would talk to her and she'd lick my face with her sandpaper tongue. I think my face was the only thing that was clean. I had one bath and she embarrassed me so bad I never asked for another one. The only thing she gave me to eat was sour milk and fried potatoes, so I shared my food with the pigs. Because she had pork chops in there, she had sausage in there, she had all kinds of good stuff, potato pancakes, so I ate the pigs' food. But you know what? I never once stopped believing. I figured God was busy. It was a war. There are a lot of people getting hurt. He'll remember me. Pretty soon he'll remember me. That was my whole plan. And he did. And he got me out of there. And he got me back to America. And I was able to find out what it's like to see streetlights on without worrying about bombers coming. Not to walk around with a candle all the time and all the windows darkened out so that the planes wouldn't see you. And the first Americans that I first met, they were mean as sin. They came in there like they were worse than the Nazis. I couldn't figure it out. My mother said, wait till you get back to America. Those people are so nice. Well, when they came, they were monsters. But you know why? Because they had seen the concentration camps. And we didn't know they had them. And they thought all the German people were responsible. And so they hated us all. They actually shot at Peter and I when we were in a tree picking apples. They came down with a plane so low, right over the telephone wires. We saw when they came, and Peter made eye contact with the pilot. And he said, Marlies, get out of there. The pilot saw me. He's going to come back. So I slid down the ladder and rolled over one side. He went down the other side and rolled in that direction. And sure enough, he came back, and they shot right through that tree and made that tree just disappeared. If we'd have been in that tree, we'd have been shot by the Americans at the end of the war. And then when they finally came into our village, my mother had a strong German accent. They didn't trust her. They didn't believe she was American. My father had to stay in the city when we were bombed out. This is when we were bombed out, we moved down on the Rhine, near the Remagen Bridge. We saw that bridge, the Germans trying to bomb it. They sent 3 planes, and I've read history books where they said they sent over 30 planes. They didn't have 30 planes, and if they did, they didn't have enough fuel to fly them. 3 planes came. The first 2 were shot down by the Americans. The 3rd plane was already on fire and hit the edge of the bridge and did some damage, but the Americans were able to come through the other side of the bridge, and that's how they came into our village. And when they first came in, they looked terrible. They had their hair, one guy had his hair parted in the middle, one side was all black, the other side all red, and he looked as mean as sin. And the first thing they asked us for was food. And I looked at Peter, I said, Peter, I thought Mom said Americans had food. First thing they asked for. And the only thing we could offer them was the lady where we were staying had an orchard, and we had just picked some apples. So my mother said, I can offer you some apples. And they made Peter and I take an apple and bite into it to make sure it wasn't poisoned. And they just stormed that bin and took all the apples. And one soldier reached in his pocket and took out 2 sticks of gum. He gave one to me, and he gave one to Peter. And we went behind a house, and we're sitting there, and I said to Peter, you know what? All the stories Mom told us about America, they're all lies. And he says, what makes you think that? I says, the Americans come, and what? They look as mean as the Germans. They have no food, they're hungry. Well, I didn't realize their supplies weren't catching up with them as fast as they were moving. These guys were moving quickly, and all their supplies were not catching up with them, and that's why they were hungry. And I said, not only that, I said, look how skinny their candy is. I didn't know that was gum. And so we ate it. And a while later, my mother came and she said, who still has their gum? And I said, Mom, we haven't had candy in 6 years. Did you think that skinny little candy was going to last that long? And she said, oh no, that's gum. You can chew that all day. My next stick of gum lasted me 3 months. I put it on the back of my bed, then I take it in the morning and chew it again. 3 months, 1 stick of gum. And you know what? The spearmint loses its flavor. It really does.
Mrs. DiFante, we want to give you a little break in between here.
Okay.
And then invite questions from our students at this time. You're both going to get seated. That works out for you.
Okay.
Some water here for you.
Oh no, that's fine, I'm fine, yeah.
I'll leave it back here for them.
Now.
Would you like to stay standing or would you like to be seated for?
No, I'll be fine.
You're good. Okay. So we're going to begin with questions at this time. We're down to just about 20 minutes. And who would like to start the questions?
Yes.
Very good.
Is it hard to talk about what you went through, about what you and your family experienced?
It was when I think when I first started, and I really had no intention on making this into a book. I put it on tape because I wanted my children to know what we had gone through. Because whenever they would sit at the table, my son would say, that's not what Mom said, and my daughter would say, yes it was. And as I said, everybody perceives something differently. So I decided to put it on tape. And my daughter-in-law ended up typing it up because she was going to use it in college for her thesis. And she brought me the manuscript, and I said, what's this? And she said, it's your story. I've decided to type it up. And I said, Anne-Marie, I don't think we can let that go into a public library through your theses. I said, so you have to do something else. So we had it laying around for like 10 years, and then it finally came out. And that's when I started doing the presentations. And in the beginning it's hard because you have to relive all those awful times. But what it has taught me is so many people have been affected by what I've told them. And they said, you know what? I used to feel so sorry for myself because something wasn't going right. I'm not feeling that anymore. I received a letter from a prisoner who read my book. He wrote me a letter and he said he tried 5 times to write this letter. And when he read my book, he said he cried many times. He said he's been in prison since 2008. And his whole attitude used to always be the woe me attitude. He says, after reading your book, I've kicked it to the curb and I've decided to take responsibility for what I've done. Now, I hope to get out, and when I do, I want to thank those people in my family, my daughter, my mother, and all those that have stood beside me and brought me back. He says, I'm going to take responsibility for what I've done, and I want to be a better citizen. I never want to have this happen to me again. But it's all my own fault. When I get a letter like that, to me, I think my book was worth it because it's made a change in a person's life who could have been just as well a mean person and blamed everything on everyone but himself. And that's why I think it's important for me to come and speak to people. And bullying, do you know how awful that is? I've been there. I know what that's like, to have no one. And why do you look at people? Because they don't have the same shoes you can wear, or because they don't have the nice clothes that you can wear, or they can't go to the same places you can. Why don't you just be nice to them? All you got to do is say hi. Give them a smile. That's all it takes. You don't have to be friends, but show them that they are all important. And you know what my grandmother told me one time? She says, do you know that at one time, I asked her once, I said, Ma, why are there so many different colored people in the world? And she said to me, it's all Elijah's fault. If any of you have never read the Bible, you should read the Old Testament about Elijah, who went to heaven in a fiery cart. He started out in Africa. And the people in Africa were very, very religious people. So when he went up into the heavens with that fiery cart, they had their hands folded and they had no shoes on, and they were watching him go up into heaven, and the fire was so hot it burned them, and that's why they turned black. As he went a little higher, you had the Indians, because they all got sunburned. As he got higher yet, you had the Asians. They were just toasted a little bit. And once he got over us, we all stayed white. My grandmother said it's all Elijah's fault. We all belong to the same group of people, no matter what color people are, no matter what nationality they are, no matter where they come from. Treat everyone with at least one smile a day and a nice greeting. That's all it takes. You'll feel better about yourself, and you make their day. That might be the only smile they'll ever get. You don't know what their home life is like. Try it. Don't bully anybody. I have no remorse against anything that happened to us. I don't blame anyone for what happened. It was something that happened to us because God allowed it to happen. We became better people because of it. My brothers are phenomenal guys. My brother Peter is a history teacher in Cortland. They made him teacher of the year 3 times. The kids loved him. My brother Johnny was in the Air Force. He actually retired from the Air Force. He ended up starting a Job Corps Center. He was the head of the Job Corps Center of all of the West Coast. And you know what they do? They bring children who've been arrested or that have been dropouts from school that are in trouble, bring them into a center. They have to get their high school education and they learn a trade. And then he lets them go out and they become productive citizens. That's what Johnny does. He could have just as well been a little Nazi because he was born over there. But they all turned out to be good people. And the best thing you can do for yourself, be kind to your parents, be very, very, always show a lot of respect for anyone older than you are, your teachers, your professors, your police officers, your firemen, your soldiers, but most of all your parents. Always be kind to them. For me, I believe I'm one of the luckiest people in the world. I had all of that. The best parents, the best brothers, the best teachers. I learned how to speak English. When I first came to America, my dad was a scorch. He taught us in Germany, that year that we were waiting to come back to the States, taught us to sing My Country 'Tis of Thee. I don't know if it's in my book or not, but I went to my first assembly program. Couldn't speak any English. I knew mother and father and thank you, and I'm from Naples, New York. I even had that wrong. So we go to assembly program. What do? They play My Country 'Tis of Thee. And Peter and I are real happy because we know that song, right? So we started singing, but had all the wrong words. And we sang, My country 'tis of thee, I came from Germany, my name is John. Give me some sauerkraut, don't leave the hot dogs out, and plenty of lager beer, and I'll stay here. Those kids started laughing until I finally learned, and I went home and told my father, I said, we were singing the wrong songs, and he said, yes, I knew that would pay off someday. So that's how all he cared, was making us look like jerks, you know, but we learned. Anyone else? Does anyone else have a question? Yes?
Did you keep any notes or a diary throughout this whole thing?
No, not once, no. And my husband can tell you, I never had anything like that, no. It just was easy to come back, and I think if anything ever happens in your life that really frightens you, you just don't forget. You do not forget. Yes?
Was it hard for you before you talk about the experience there?
When I first started speaking about it,
Or when you like first started writing about
no, I thought it should be done. I thought it would help others. And I thought it would help people who go through tough times to know that it never gets that tough. As long as you have faith, as long as you have someone who loves you, it doesn't matter even if it's just an animal. If you have someone that loves you, but the last thing you should ever give up is hope. Never give up hope, because that comes from the evil one. That does not come from God. You always have to have hope, because tomorrow is going to be a better day, and nothing lasts forever. That's what I feel. Yes?
Well, I was just like wondering like how, sorry, I forgot my question. Oh yeah, so like how have the like traumatic experiences that you've had like affect your decision making today, or like how you look at it?
I think it made a big difference in how I feel, because I see things that people do that I just don't understand. You know how they try to get even when something happens that's bad to them? They try to get even. That's not the way to go. It took me a long time to forgive my aunt. My mother used to say, you have to forgive her. And I couldn't. I just couldn't. I wanted to send her a ticket so she could come to America, so I could have her walk down the street in Naples, and I was going to run her down with my car. And I was going to back over her, and I was going to run her down again, because I wanted her out of this world, because she should never treat someone like that again. That's how much hatred I had for her. But then I realized, if you don't forgive, God's not going to forgive you either. And if any of you know the Our Father, first thing you say in the Our Father is, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who trespass against us. Well, if you want to be forgiven as you forgive, and if you don't forgive, he's not going to forgive you either. That's the way it works. So I had to do it. And now, if he's ever going to let me in up there, because when I've been sick, very sick, you know what my father told me when I had cancer? I went home and told him I had cancer. Well, my father said, he said, I don't know what you're worried about. You're not going anywhere. You're not good enough to go to heaven. You're not bad enough to go to hell. You're going to be around a while. That's what he answered me. I was heartbroken. I said, he doesn't even love me. How could he talk to me that way? Well, when I went home, my mother called me the next day, and she said, when you walked out of the house, your father sat here and cried. And he said, if something ever happens to that girl, I don't want to live another day. See, he never wanted me to know how much you cared. That's just the way he was. But I knew. I knew, yes.
How do you think your mom was able to like stay so strong when things were being forced to walk those 5 miles to like show people?
I don't know. She never gave up. She really never gave up, and she would do what they told her. And the sad part about it is that she never had the $15 to become an American citizen when she was here. So when she left here, she was not an American citizen. And then the Germans took her citizenship away because she had married an American and lived here for 7 years, so she had no country. And we had to leave her there. When we came to America, that was one of the hardest things that I'd ever been through. Even living with my aunt wasn't as hard as leaving my mother there. If you could have seen her, she was 70 pounds, and her shoes were nothing but layers of cardboard with a little bit of what was left of her old shoe and rope. Those were her shoes. And she stood there so thin and so hungry. I know how hungry she must have been, because whenever she had something, she used to try to give it to us. And then we give it to Johnny, the baby. He didn't suffer as much as Peter and I did, because whenever we had anything, we gave it to him because he was the baby. Well, that was sometimes really hard, And I think if you read in there about my waffles, I went to my first party. Those waffles stayed in my nostrils for years. I could smell them when I went to bed at night. I could smell them no matter where I went. I would turn around sometimes to look to see where those waffle smell came from. That stupid waffle smell never left my senses, and I never even got to taste them. You can give up a lot. You can give up a lot. But you can make it. Nothing is so tough you can't make it. But you need faith, you need love, and you need hope. You always have to hope for a better day, and it's coming. Always comes. Anyone else? Yes.
Looking back on what those children did to you, knowing that like they were told that Americans were bad, would you still like, if they came up to you today and apologized, would you accept it?
Oh, yes. Yeah, because they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know. I'm sure they didn't know. And you can accept an apologies are beautiful. And no, I don't have anything against anyone. I really don't. And you know, I felt sorry for the German people, because when there was a bombing and so many people were killed at one night, there was no time for funerals. Do you know how many of those people were just picked up and thrown in the back of a wheelbarrow or a wagon or a truck and then dumped into a bomb hole and covered up with debris and dirt and everything? They have no place to mourn their dead. There's no cemetery plot that they can go to. But I believe our God is so good that when you see a cloud, just a small cloud with soft rain, you know what I believe that is? I believe all the tears from people who've lost someone and don't even know where they're buried. This is for people that are now missing, soldiers that are missing in action somewhere in a foreign country. There's nowhere for that family to mourn them. So what God does, He sends His angels to take the tears from that family, put them in that little cloud, and then sends that cloud to where that person is buried, and that cloud drops the tears on top of the grave so that that person is not uncried for. That's what I believe. No, you don't have to believe that. That's just something I believe. And I never read it anywhere, so, but that's what I believe. But, yes.
So, did you ever hear from your Aunt Lena after?
She wrote a letter when the Americans came in. Her husband, who was, I really didn't get to know him. I think maybe all the year I was there, I think I spoke to him 3 times at the most. He built a fence for me once, but I never got to see him. He was always hiding in his workshop. And he was walking across a bridge, and a shell hit the bridge, and he was killed. Her son, which I didn't even know she had a son, was fighting, a German soldier fighting in Russia. When he came home, when the war ended, he had lost his arm. And when he walked into the house, he had found out from town people that his mother was an informer for the Nazis. So when he came home, he asked her, he says, "You've been an informer?" And she said, "Well, whatever works." And he says, "I never want to see you again." And he turned around and walked away from her. She never got to see her son again. And because if you had any connections with the Nazis at the end of the war, the Americans and the German people got together, and those people were not allowed to have ration cards. If you knew for sure you were an informant, you didn't get any ration cards. So now you had to struggle finding food. No one in that town would give her anything to eat, and she was starving. So she sent us a letter asking us to send her a package with food that wouldn't spoil. And I read the letter and I said to my father, "If you send her even one crumb, I'll leave this house and never come back." Now, knowing my mother, she would never let me know for sure, but I got a feeling she must have sent her something, because that's just the way my mother was. But I never told my mother how bad it was at my aunt's. She never knew. And I'm kind of glad my parents are dead before this book came out, because they never really knew. My mother just thought that I had gotten that dirty and that filled with lice just for a short period of time. They didn't know what happened right from the beginning, that I'd been like that for a year. And I had no friends. I never talked about it because I didn't want to hurt them. And it was my father's sister. Didn't want to hurt him either. So what my mother did, I don't know, but that's okay too. Yes?
What kind of role do you think your faith played in giving you the strength to go through everything you did?
I think my faith is all there was. If it hadn't been for my trust in God, that knowing that, I know he, like I said, I know he was busy. A lot of people needed him. And I figured he would just take a little time to find me. You know, since I was small and maybe he just kind of forgot about me. But he'd get around to me pretty soon, and I never gave up hope that he would help me, and he did. And when the war ended and the German soldiers came home, they looked so beaten and so, many of them were wounded. They just had rags tied around their arms, and they were limping with a stick under their arm, no crutches or anything. And I saw those 3 German soldiers walking, and I said to my brother Peter, they look so hungry. I'm going to go ask them if they want something to eat. And he says, what are you going to offer them? We don't have anything. I said, Mom always finds something. And he says, leave them alone. Don't go talk to them. And I went up to him and I asked him, I said, are you men hungry? And the one German soldier just looked at me and he said, isn't everybody in Germany? And I said, well, we have some food. And he said, you do? He says, you look like you've had a lot of food. Here I am, 11 years old, I weigh 42 pounds. Didn't look like I had any food. But I said, come on, I'll bring you home. I said, my mom always has something. So now I take him home, and we had an apartment upstairs in this little town of Minningen. And I said, you wait here, I'll go talk to my mom. I went upstairs, I said, Mom, do we have anything to eat? There's 3 German soldiers down there. And they asked me if they had any food. See, I lied. They didn't ask me then. I asked them. But I didn't tell her that. She says, Marlies, have them come up. And they came upstairs, and my mother had a little bit of, well, the soup that we would have would be like potatoes, a few carrots from the garden, maybe some celery and water, and that was our soup. I mean, there was never any flavoring, you know. If you had a chicken, it would just walk around the outside of the kettle, never got into it. So there was never anything except water and vegetables together. She had a little soup, and that was supposed to be for our supper, and a small piece of bread about this big. So she cut it in 3 pieces, and she had the German soldiers sit down and gave them the soup. You know what they said? This is the first warm meal we've had in 3 years. And then when they finished, my mother gave them all the soup she had. One of the German soldiers said to her, Mrs. Adams, this was all you had, wasn't it? And my mother said, it's okay. There are many times we haven't had anything. She says, we'll manage. We will somehow manage. And he said to her, well, may God bless you and your family from this day on. May you never go hungry again. That same afternoon, the Americans came, and they told us we could go to the UNNRA. That was a unit, or an area that was set up where they helped relieve people that had really gone through stress, and we were finally allowed to come there, and they offered us food. They gave us a loaf of bread, they gave us some things to take home, some Spam, so we had some food, and we could go once a month to get food there. From there, we were sent to camp in Bremen, and they let us eat something there at the camp before they put us on board ship, and we came to America. I have never had to be hungry again after we gave everything we had to those 3 soldiers. See how God watches over you?
Sir, we don't want to end abruptly, but at the same time, we do want to make sure we thank you before the bell rings and everybody has to leave. And we have our English teacher, Mrs. Quill, here, who's going to just come on up briefly. If you have to go, we certainly understand. If you're saying to get a book, that's fine too. Mrs. Quill here wants to do a little...
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank all of you.